I would say, like, the big takeaway for me is that we are not paying enough staff to take on the kind of maintenance that's necessary. We have very, very thin staff at the Parks Department for those needs. In addition, I don't think our buildings in the city of Richmond are designed to the standard that we need them to be designed for to be resilient, given the number of days with extreme heat that we have now and in the future. So I think we're not designing to be resilient currently. I don't think we're funding our public divisions to the extent that we need to be funding them to in order to keep up with the maintenance needs, even of new facilities, let alone old facilities. And I think closely related is the fact that we live in a city that has a lot of historic fabric in it, and we don't necessarily maintain the historic fabric in a way that is in I would just say a lot of our historic facilities are not the financing necessary to maintain a historic facility is not something that typically the public sector has access to.
Those are good points. I think another thing to think about with these two is increased need for community buildings due to climate impact. So you're going to see people like overheating, like in hot summers, and they don't have AC, needing to use these buildings more as like, cooling centers or places to go for extreme flooding. And so you can anticipate not only that maybe they're not funded to the capacity they need to be now to parks buildings and other community buildings, but there's going to be increased need for them in the future that's going to exacerbate that situation.
Also, Brianne, I wanted to ask you, are you considering the soil in which the building is anchored?
Yeah.
Okay, because I think more so in Chesterfield County, perhaps, but certainly there's an issue with the clay soil.
Mm. Barb, your audio went out for me. Yeah, I'm sorry, Barb. For some reason, we can't hear you, but I totally know where you were going, and we do want you all. Oh, now it's saying my internet is unstable. If you all can hear me, please feel free to continue working, and I'll get this resolved. Zoom on a Friday, right? Like, I don't.
I could hear Barbara when she was speaking, so if she wanted to continue speaking, I can continue to take notes.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just posing the question about the underlying soil. In the foundation a building is anchored in, and the issue of shrink swell soil in particular, how unstable it is and how that can degrade a building. And with all the sustained water events, is this something that's impacting the physical structures all the more?
Awesome. Thank you, Barb. Great point. Definitely moving into water threats. We do want to be considering not just the building itself, but where it is, what it's on, all of that. I do want to, hopefully y'all can hear me now. Just give me a thumbs up, someone. Yeah, okay. I want to keep us on track as far as time. So we're already kind of getting into some of the other topics as far as these facilities go. So feel free to work your way through this page as we continue talking. On the adaptive capacity sort of section, again, we're thinking about the other side of sensitivity, which is even if some kind of thing did happen, like a heat wave or a flood, is there any kind of natural built-in resilience to these types of assets that could help them bounce back? This would, for a building, be something like it being elevated or having some sort of other flood protection. For something like heat, it could be like a green roof or something that keeps it a little naturally cooler during a heat wave. Any thoughts that you all have on that are more than welcome. And then I encourage you, as you continue to look through this, to then go on to the consequence section, which is where we're asking you to think about not just the the thing itself, but if it were to go down, again, doomsday scenario, what is the impact to the broader community? And you may not have an idea of things like cost and all of that, and that's totally okay. But where are the areas of concern for something like a community center or a library? I would think, thinking about our vulnerable populations, potentially even public safety or public health, if we're using these facilities as like cooling shelters during heat waves and they go down and they're not usable, something like that. But I'll let you all continue to work on this and discuss for the next couple minutes. And then while you're finishing that up, I apologize. I totally forgot to give you another link, which is not critical, but did want to provide it for anyone who wants to look at some of these assets on a map, just to see how many things we might be talking about, where they might be located. Again, don't get too bogged down in exactly where these things are, like are they near the river or a flood scenario or something. If you navigate to the bottom of that mapping tool and click on the little pink person with a book, you'll see a list of a lot of the assets we're talking about in this group, just to get a sense of where these are. Are any questions or thoughts coming up for you all as you work into the consequence section?
I guess I'm just trying to think of this as a collection of assets versus one asset. And I mean, I'm not an expert. I know there are folks in the construction industry that actually analyze the cost of what it takes to bring buildings back to a high level of sort of functionality. But I mean, yeah, I'm not an expert, but I'm just saying, I would imagine that along a lot of these criteria, like area of service loss, duration, public safety, economic impact, it might be a moderate loss, but when taken as a whole, it looks like sort of a systemic failure.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I am not an expert either. We have had, for example, in one of our other working groups, which is the Buildings and Energy Working Group, we were looking at some of these same things, and we did have engineers and folks who could evaluate like, oh, 3 feet of flooding equals this kind of remediation cost or something. That's totally fine if you all don't know what that is. And we're just valuing whatever you bring to this discussion. And I think with the territory of what we're covering, because these are critical to our community, just comes naturally that we're talking about greater impacts. That's not going to be necessarily true for some of the other things that we look at. So y'all take about 2 more minutes, and then I do want to move us on to our next group of assets. One last thing, sorry, I'll note on the consequence area, it might be helpful to think about the areas of consequence, at least when it comes to public safety, economy, et cetera, about the relative consequence So, are the impacts to public safety going to be higher and lower than the potential impacts to public health, for example? And you can use that to help rate these things if it's useful to you.
I'm not sure how helpful it is, but just speaking from experience, I know sometimes voting stations have been firehouses. So I wasn't sure if that was helpful for some people to take into consideration when listing some of these, the implications of the threats.
Yeah, good to know. Thanks, Javon. I know I've also voted at Retreat Hospital in the fan before. So they're all over the place, really. So for those of you who are ready, let's go ahead and click next on your survey tool. If you want to stay on the page we were just on, feel free and use time to wrap up. But again, just for those who are ready, let's move on to our next sort of rough grouping of assets. This is probably the one that covers the most diverse range of assets that we'll talk about. So as you think about sensitivity and adaptive capacity and consequence, feel free to use the comment section or just voice, and we will record, obviously, your thoughts if you would like to talk about any one particular thing. But with this grouping, we're looking at privately owned and managed buildings that serve some sort of potentially critical purpose in our community that we want to think about the risks posed by climate change. So this includes cultural assets like museums, as well as centers for senior and childcare. I'll note that both of those are just for day care. These are not places where people live or would stay overnight. And then religious centers would include churches, synagogues, mosques, and any other sort of place of worship. So with all of that in mind, feel free to just voice out loud any thoughts you have as you're walking through the activity now that you've done it once and kind of know what it entails. And Barb, I'm wondering, just given your knowledge and areas of interest, if you would be able to tell us any more information about sort of the function of things like senior centers and how they're used potentially by the community, not specifically here in Richmond, just generally in case people are not familiar. And if not, that's okay. Anyone is welcome to voice any thoughts on any of these things.
Well, I was just thinking about, like, especially childcare centers and, senior centers, during extreme heat, like, they might have to limit outdoor activities, or their participants could come already like exhausted from the heat. So their staff might be dealing with more like heat related medical emergencies. So that would, like, should we be thinking about like the people in those buildings?
Yes,
too,
definitely.
right? Yeah.
Yep. So the folks who who work there, you know, if they're potentially, maybe not for these instances, but if they're working outdoors, you know, definitely impacted by these kinds of threats, but also how their capacity might be impacted by a threat, just making it more, you know, more of like an emergency situation because of something going on. Yep. A better example we discussed yesterday in one of our groups was thinking through the airport, even though it's not within the city, but lots of people who work there work outdoors, directing traffic and things like that. And so thinking about, you know, just acclimating people to being safe during things like heat events and whatnot was a big consideration for the functionality of that particular asset. So we're going to take about 5 more minutes on this one and then move on to the next grouping. You all just let me know if you'd like more time. And I should have said this at the very beginning, but just in case it's helpful for anyone now, we're thinking in non-COVID terms. So just hoping that someday we get back to not having to deal with a global pandemic like we are today, and we are just facing, you know, a threat like climate change. I know that COVID has impacted so many of the things that we're talking about, so we don't want that to muddy any of the waters. So again, just take a couple more minutes and wrap up private buildings if you can, or let me know if you would like more time. Oh, thanks, Janae. Yes, let me put it in the, oh, I see that you messaged me. Here we go. I'm going to put the link in the chat. If you want to just skip to the second page, we are working right now on community buildings and evaluating their potential threats that climate change could bring to them. Please let me know if you have any questions as you get back into this. Thanks. All right, and for those who are ready, let's go ahead and move on to the next page. This next set of assets that we'll be looking at, we have two groupings of educational kinds of assets. The first one that we're looking at is Richmond's public schools and public school system. The reason, and then the next grouping we'll be looking at are other educational institutions. The reason that we separated these two in terms of the discussion is just because of the management and control of these kinds of facilities, but also, and you all might know more than me for sure, our public schools are used for lots of things in addition to just the education of our city's children, and so might play a somewhat different role in our communities than some of our other educational kinds of facilities. So again, non-COVID times, think about how something like a heat wave, again, extreme heat wave, or some sort of deluge of rain or flooding event might impact our public schools. And then once you get down to the consequence section, you don't have to think about a total system failure of our public school system. Rather, you could think about like one school, for example, being shut down because of some type of event. And I'll just note, I think, Giles, what you were saying about generally the community, the city's facilities, maintenance, age, chronic stress, I think all of that still would apply to most of our public school buildings. And I'm sure you all have seen, the articles and things that have come out about school buildings in the last few years or so. So we want to incorporate those chronic stresses into thinking about how these facilities would handle something like an additional sort of acute shock of a climate threat. So we'll take, again, about 10 minutes to fill out this section. Y'all feel free to voice any thoughts or questions about public schools and climate change as you work through this.
I'm curious why we're considering just one school instead of all schools, whereas we consider groupings of other buildings.
Yeah, so I think you could really take it either way. Part of what we hope to do for buildings like our public schools is identify which ones are actually in harm's way, which is part of the work that we're doing internally to evaluate, like, where are the actual urban heat islands, where are the floodplains. And so I think for this, the total shutdown of like our entire public school system could definitely be a risk if there were something like a really catastrophic heat wave or a widespread flood event that was impacting our city. So honestly, if you want to think through it that way, you're more than welcome to do so and think through the impacts of that. Or if it's easier, like if you're more thinking about the individual facility side, please feel free to put that, and then you can just note in the comments kind of what your thoughts were there. So I would say, Javon, just think about it in whichever way is easier for you based on your knowledge and experience, if that works.
Brian, I had a question.
Yeah.
well, I'm going back to the sort of groupings of assets. I'm not sure what we have in front of us to cover. I wasn't going ahead, but with parks and stuff like that, is that still coming up?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And if you want, you can
Click ahead.
click ahead. You can always come back too. So for anyone who might have to leave early, feel free to click ahead in the survey now that you kind of get the gist of what we're doing.
Okay. And I guess the question that I have in mind is like, to what extent parks as like serving environmental services is in there? But I don't know. That's just sort of been a question that I have generally.
Yeah. So we can definitely talk about that more once we get to that section, but just I'll say that we do have some overlap between some of our working groups and the particular kinds of things they're thinking about. So for this group, what we have done is focused thinking about parks. So we have a grouping of community gardens, parks, and playgrounds. And we're thinking more about the role that those kinds of things have in the community. And then on Monday, our environment working group will be meeting to think more about the some of those spaces as green spaces with trees and vegetation and the ability to cool our communities. So today, what we're focusing more on is like the service that those provide.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Same thing with buildings. Like none of us are engineers, I'm presuming. So we're thinking more about the human side of these things. I realize I am a little off on my timing, my math, I mean, so take a couple more minutes and wrap up public schools if you can, or you're welcome to stay here. But I am going to invite the rest of you who are ready to move on to our next section, which is other educational institutions. And again, this is a pretty big grouping of post-secondary education facilities as well as private schools. We have many private K through 12 schools here in Richmond. I know all of these different types of places will serve different functions. So feel free to put, as always, any comments about any particular one that you have and its potential threats. I'm wondering, Richard, if you're there and if you're comfortable, based on what you shared about your background, if you have any particular knowledge or thoughts about how even nationally colleges and universities have dealt with climate threats and things like that when it comes to like heat or flooding generally.
Yeah, I mean, it's all over the place, as you imagine, depending on the type of institution. There is a consortium of higher ed institutions. It's a group called Second Nature, and they're kind of collectively banding together to, their focus has mostly been on kind of campus retrofitting and sustainability and, green infrastructure. Some of them are also moving towards programmatic issues like, skills-based stuff for students in a kind of a new green economy, and also community colleges in particular, the kind of student populations that in their communities where they're more connected with generally, and how they can kind of be partners in the community. But it's early, and I wouldn't say maybe a few institutions are kind of leading the way, but I think they're lagging for the most part. I think the one place where higher ed, even at the community college level, seems to be maybe a little bit ahead of the game is just with the kind of infrastructure and designing, when they do build new buildings, have them kind of LEED certified, and planning for, the future more. But I don't know if that's, I'm kind of anecdotal for me.
Yeah. Sarah, do you have anything based on your work at VCU that you know of that VCU is doing on that end of like disaster preparedness or any kind of stuff like that? I know a few of us went to VCU, but I don't know anything about that.
That is not really my wheelhouse, but I do know there is a growing sort of grassroots faculty and staff group on campus that has expressed interest in like broadening the sustainability movement at VCU. And I think now since COVID has come along, like I think it's an excellent time for entities like VCU to think about like, okay, like sustainability, public health, emergency preparedness, like maybe we should be thinking about all of these in a grand like sustainability and public safety plan instead of like siloing them. So I wish I had a more specific update, but I know I, for one, am a proponent of thinking about sort of this emergency preparedness within our broader sustainability discussions.
Got it. Cool. Yeah, my last job was actually at a university, and I know this was a few years ago now, but we were just getting into those sorts of, discussions about thinking about future risks rather than like immediate risks like cyber attacks and, on campus sort of shooter events, like all of that. People were really into preparing for that kind of stuff and had plans in place. But when it came to like, we have X number of students who live here and are in, unconditioned dorms. We face, temperatures of whatever, and this is caused, we weren't getting into that as much. Yeah. Well, thank you.
And I think that's sort of where we're at too, but hopefully expanding the discussion to, be more prepared for future risks.
Mm-hmm. And I would also encourage you all, as you're thinking about the consequence when it comes to these sorts of facilities, how many people in our community not only live at some of these locations, but also work at these locations. I know VCU / the health system has thousands of employees, I'm guessing. And so it's a lot of people who come, in and out of downtown and the city and rely on these institutions for their employment. And so that's just one of the other areas of impact that could potentially be affected.
I think VCU has over 20,000 employees. With that does include like all the health system employees, but yeah, it's a big entity.
Yeah.
Would you say that would relate more to cost of damage, or is that more cost of damage is not necessarily looking at whose pay might be affected, it's looking at the repair?
Yeah, so what we're getting at more with cost of damage is like the literal, what is it going to take financially to bring back this building or institution or system to what it was before the threat struck, the heat wave or the flooding event. But Javon, what I would include in economic activities is, 20,000 people. That's a lot of people who rely on that system. Well, that one institution alone for like their livelihood and wages and all of that. So I would include that there. So just in the interest of time, if y'all could take maybe 2 or 3 more minutes on the educational institutions section, and then I want to move us along as a group to our second to last asset grouping. But please feel free to continue voicing your thoughts and questions. I was trying to look up how many employees Virginia Union University has. Can't find it immediately, but looks like they have at least a couple thousand students. So I'm guessing that while smaller than VCU, certainly a lot of people depend on that institution as well. But anyway, for those who are ready, go ahead and hit next on your survey tool. For something a little bit different, we're going to be talking about those green and outdoor space sort of assets now. Again, these are this is a rough grouping of things like community gardens, as well as parks and playgrounds. And we're thinking here, when it comes to sensitivity and adaptive capacity, actually, about their physical ability to withstand impacts. And then on the consequence side, thinking a little bit more about the role of these types of facilities in our community. Kate and Giles and Paul, anyone on the parks team, would love to hear any thoughts you have as you think through this part of our activity.
I guess I was just thinking about how we already see, I think parks in a lot of ways are the canary in the cage of climate change. And I, take my dog for a walk in Bird Park and I see all of these much older trees that are kind of slowly dying, and not to be dark about it, but it's happening across the city. And it's very difficult to replace the tree canopy as it gets hotter and maintain those trees. So I feel like the whole canary in the cage thing is you kind of see what's coming further down the line in a much more economically impactful way. And so I think it's also, parks can also be a place where some of the kind of mitigation strategies can happen quickly. And I hope they will. But then I was just also thinking about how important parks are for community members to get out and just build up their mental health, create sort of social bonds with each other in addition to their physical health. And we see that all the time. But as days get hotter in the summer and we have other sort of weather-related events, people are just driven inside. And I think that has an impact on their physical and social and emotional well-being.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking, like, when we have extreme rain, like we see, like with JRPS, like there's a bunch of trails, not available during flooding. The whole pony pasture parking lot was covered that last big flood. And even I remember a few years ago, we had that storm that canceled the last day of school. I don't know if anybody remembers, but like Bryant Park was closed because there's trees down just across the road. So these events can really like limit access.
Yeah, one other thing that that made me think about is just we have this weird invasive species problem, this weird thing that like I always avoided really delving into because who likes to deal with weeds all the time? But like it creates a runoff issue, which creates water issues and plumbing issues to our infrastructure, and it crowds out all of our native species that kind of keep the environment in Richmond healthy. So like, as the heat kind of kills off levels of our ecosystem, it creates this problem for use of parks as well. But it's really interesting to think of weeds as a climate issue, but they are, and I think they don't create cooler spaces, according to Jeremy's research. So I think that's kind of fascinating.
And they're just a huge threat to our canopy, like the trees getting gobbled up by English ivy. Like if we might lose a whole lot. And yeah.
Have you seen over time or know anecdotally at all that invasive species are getting any worse, you know, like in recent times? Yeah.
Yeah, but there's also been a lot more attention given to invasive species, and there's a whole lot of support from outside the park system for taking a science-based approach to mitigating. We're also looking at workforce development as a way of both like getting money into the pockets of people who may have been unemployed to get trained up in invasive species reduction, because it's a massive issue. And it's kind of, it's not something that, it's not an interesting issue to a lot of people.
Well, and the stormwater management piece of that, like when you remove these invasive species, you're removing what's holding the dirt in place. And so with these large rain events and our, you know, just our inability to like slow this water down as it's rushing towards the river and rushing, that we just risk losing a whole lot of soil. So they're super related, those two issues.
And then while we still have a couple minutes on this, I also wanted to ask or sort of prompt folks to think about the physical infrastructure at these places. And the reason I bring this up is just thinking about that New York Times article that came out last year during the summer, I think, that highlighted a mother who avoided taking her children to a playground that was exposed to, didn't have tree canopy because the equipment got too hot to actually be safe to use. And I think that is something, in addition to the natural sort of resource side, you know, the actual usability of these spaces. I think, Kate, to your point, I grew up at the beach, and whenever there were hurricanes, our power would go out and my mom would kick us out of the house because it's hot and miserable. And if we didn't have a park to go to because it was closed, we would have been in a whole mess of trouble. So, yeah.
Sent you out into a hurricane?
Oh, no, I mean, afterwards, it would take like weeks for our power to come back on. So. But we were probably out in hurricanes too. Who knows?
There's an economic angle to this too, beyond what Giles was talking about, which is, you know, climate refugees, right? Or people who are, you know, I've been reading articles about people who are just moving away from the Southwest, moving away from California, and trying to pick out, you know, strategically pick out places that are either, you know, it's beginning to try to mitigate, you know, climate impacts through, but, you know, different efforts. And so I think if you think of, you know, eliminating invasive species and replacing them, you know, maybe with endemic species, so you don't have that soil erosion, and come up with a plan to really kind of preserve green space for the future, you know, for hotter temperatures, and ways that you're going to have a city that's going to be attractive to continue to be attractive to people to come here, and even as the climate changes. So I think, you know, I think that's another way of thinking about it as well.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of like just the argument for regionalism, because I think there is a desire in communities who live here, and communities or people who are interested in moving here, for park infrastructure and connected park infrastructure so they can walk around, whether it's in a loop in their neighborhood or to get from their neighborhood to the James River. And a lot of that infrastructure is expensive, but it turns out that it is a really important economic development tool. So I don't know. I think a lot of what we're talking about comes back to financial structures that need to better inform the city, but also just the fact that there might not be enough for that without some kind of regional cooperation.
Awesome. This is a really great discussion. I just want to say we have about 6 minutes left. So for those who are ready, please feel free to move on to the last page of our survey tool. If you are done with the outdoor and green spaces section, This last section is a grouping of, rather than really like physical assets like buildings and whatnot, these are different types of, I think like zoning tools, maybe we'll call them, or something that the city has implemented over time to offer different types of either incentives or planning structures for communities. And the reason that we included this in our vulnerability assessment was thinking about, let's say one of these kind of incentive areas or something is in an area that also faces, you know, higher temperatures because of urban heat island or flooding issues. Maybe a strategy we could think about is building some resilience aspects or incentives into these incentive structures, so that when, you know, a business locates there, maybe they get help with a green roof or some flooding protection or something like that. I don't know. So that's why we're looking at these. You all might know more about any one of these than I do, but I'm happy to try to answer any questions that you have. Generally, though, we're thinking about how and where the city incentivizes certain types of development, and whether there are considerations to make due to climate change. And we just got our 5-minute warning, so just wanted to give you a heads up in case you didn't see that. And I believe all of these are on the map as well, if you'd like to look at them. All right, I think we will get the 1-minute countdown very soon. Feel free to keep working on this. If you are done, please hit done on your survey so that all of your responses get recorded, and we have all of your feedback. And I just want to say, while we still have some time, that we really appreciate you all spending your 2 hours with us, and especially in this hour activity that we did today. I wish that we could be in person running around with stickers and Post-its and all of that, but we did what we could with SurveyMonkey. So